In the early 20th century, a British geographer issued a warning: control Eastern Europe and you control the world. That idea became known as the Heartland Theory. For decades later, Adolf Hitler launched the largest military invasion in history, an assault on the Soviet Union. Was Hitler acting on the Heartland Theory, or did his plan to conquer the East just happen to align with it? This is the story of how a single idea, one laid out not by a soldier or a statesman, but by an academic, may have shaped one of the most consequential wars in human history. It's about how the abstract logic of maps and geography influenced real-world violence and global conflict. And it's a story that doesn't end in 1945, because the theory that framed Hitler's strategy also outlived him. Like I said, Halford Mackinder wasn't a general or a head of state. He was a British academic. He was fascinated by geography's role in shaping history. In 1904, he delivered a paper called The Geographical Pivot of History to the Royal Geographical Society, arguing that global power wouldn't depend on ships and seas anymore, it would depend on land. More specifically, on a massive region of land at the heart of Eurasia. Mackinder called this region the Heartland. It encompassed Eastern Europe and extended deep into Russia. With its enormous size, harsh climate, and difficulty of access by sea, the Heartland had long been protected from foreign conquest. But now, with the rise of railroads and mechanized transport, Mackinder believed that an empire with enough resources and the will to dominate this space could become unstoppable. He laid out his theory in a now famous formula: who rules Eastern Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. The world island, in his view, was the connected landmass of Europe, Asia, and Africa, home to the majority of the planet's people, resources, and economic potential. At the time, his theory was a challenge to the prevailing belief in sea power. Britain ruled the waves, and the United States and other rising powers believed naval strength guaranteed global influence. But Mackinder argued that the age of maritime empires was fading. The future belonged to the land-based powers that could build strongholds in the interior of Eurasia and deny access to anyone else. His warning wasn't about any specific country, but it had enormous implications. If a single power gained control over Eastern Europe and the Heartland, the rest of the world might not be able to contain it. For Mackinder, this wasn't just speculation, it was a potential threat to global stability. Over the next few decades, his ideas began to influence not just scholars, but military planners, political theorists, and eventually world leaders. Among those who took in the logic of the Heartland Theory, whether it was direct or indirect, was Adolf Hitler. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, he wasn't working from a textbook, but his worldview was grounded in a simple, brutal belief that Germany needed to expand eastward in order to survive. This expansionist vision, known as Lebensraum, wasn't just about acquiring land. It was about reordering the geopolitical map to secure Germany's dominance. Hitler believed that the German people were destined to rule over what he saw as racially and culturally inferior populations in Eastern Europe. But his strategy wasn't only ideological, it was deeply geographic. Germany, he believed, had to become self-sufficient. That meant controlling the food supply, the oil fields, the raw materials, and the industrial centers that lay to the east, especially in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Western Soviet Union. World War I had taught him a harsh lesson. The British naval blockade had devastated Germany, starving its population and cutting off crucial imports. Hitler was determined that in the next war, Germany would be immune to that kind of external pressure. His solution? Build a continental empire, one that stretched deep into Eurasia and could no longer be strangled by foreign fleets. Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941. It was the ultimate expression of this vision. It was the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers, hundreds of thousands of tanks and vehicles, and a ruthless plan to dismantle the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that with a swift strike, he could knock out the Soviet Union, seize control of the Heartland, and secure Germany's future as a global superpower. In his mind, this was a decisive move in a much larger game. By conquering the Eurasian core, Germany would sideline Britain, preempt the growing influence of the United States, and establish dominance over the world island. Whether or not he had read Mackinder directly, the parallels were unmistakable. But the Heartland proved far more resistance than he had imagined. The distances were immense, the infrastructure was inadequate, and the Soviet Union, rather than collapsing, dug in and pushed back. Hitler's army stalled outside Moscow. The winters were brutal, the Red Army regrouped, counterattacked, and over time began to turn the tide. What had started as a bid to control the world's geopolitical pivot became a catastrophic overreach. Hitler had gambled everything on the idea that Eastern Europe would fall quickly. Instead, he had awakened the very land power Mackinder had warned about, a Heartland Empire ready to fight to the death. The defeat of Nazi Germany didn't end the struggle for the Heartland. It merely shifted it. Now the Soviet Union held the territory Hitler had failed to conquer, and the next great geopolitical rivalry was already taking shape. In the Cold War, Mackinder's theory quietly resurfaced in new form. American strategists saw the Soviet Union as a land-based juggernaut with reach across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Containing it would require a global strategy and a new version of Mackinder's logic. One American thinker, Nicholas Spikeman, proposed an updated model, the Rimland Theory. He argued that control of Eurasia's coastal edges, the rimland, was the real key to power, but the underlying concern remained the same: prevent any one power from dominating Eurasia's core. The US response was multi-pronged: NATO in Europe, military pacts in the Middle East and Asia, a forward presence in Korea, Japan, and beyond. The strategy was to encircle the heartland with alliances, bases, and economic influence, denying the Soviet Union the chance to expand beyond its border. At the same time, the USSR reinforced its control over Eastern Europe, installing pro-Soviet governments and turning the region into a buffer zone. The Iron Curtain was not just ideological, it was geographical. It was the modern outline of the heartland, hardened by barbed wire and backed by tanks. For the next 4 decades, much of the world's diplomacy, conflict, and competition revolved around this silent tug-of-war, from the proxy wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan to the crises in Berlin and Cuba. The Cold War was fought in the shadow of a map first sketched by a British geographer. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it seemed as though the theory had once again been proven right. The heartland had resisted conquest, but it couldn't survive isolation. Without expansion or global reach, it crumbled under its own weight. The Heartland Theory began as a provocative idea on paper, but it outlived its author. It guided, shaped, and haunted the ambitions of empires across the 20th century. For Hitler, it provided an intellectual framework, however distorted, for his most ambitious and destructive war. For Cold War strategists, it explained why stakes were so high. And even now, the theory hasn't disappeared. The modern contest for influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia continues. From NATO's presence near Russia's borders to conflict over Ukraine, the shadow of Mackinder's logic persists. The map may have changed, the names and governments may be different, but the geographic truth remains. So the question is still with us. Who controls the heartland, and what will they do with it? Because some ideas don't just describe the world, they reshape it. And in geopolitics, theories like Mackinder's can become the blueprint for a century of conflict. Ideas can be weapons, and maps can be plans for war.